The Forever Promise, A Promise to Keep. A Turn of the 20th Century Romance. By Ken Mitchell. Author's note: this book was written in about the year 2000 or shortly thereafter, before the age of pocket cell phones, instant online access to the sum total of human knowledge, and while newspapers were still using film darkrooms. Rather than going back and rewriting it, I offer it to you without change for what it is. The first draft of a novel I wrote in the G-rated romance style popular at the time. I present it to you as a bit of a time capsule, and also because people have asked me, so you've written several books, how come we never get to read any of them? So here it is, in audio form, for free. Note: it's worth at least what you pay for it. Chapter 1. They Wouldn't Dare. Jessica shrieked. She stared at the top of the hill that hovers over the town of Riverton, not believing what she was seeing. Somebody was tearing down her house. Her bright hazel eyes stared in disbelief at the summit of the large rocky ridge that hovers over the western edge of sleepy little river town. She felt the sharp pain of her own fingernails pressing against her palm, and consciously eased her grip on the camera bag that she was holding. With the vision of workers tearing down her beloved house on the hill in her eyes, all thoughts of her recent interview with the retiring town librarian pushed from her mind. Behind her, she heard the tinkling of the bell that was tied to the door of the newspaper where she worked. "Jess, honey, are you okay?" Emma asked. "I thought I heard you hollering for help." Jessica forced herself to turn away from the top of the hill and look into the concerned face of her friend and employer. Jessica pointed up the hill, and Emma squinted to see what Jessica was looking at. "Well, that doesn't seem right, now, does it?" Emma said. She turned to face the tall, slender young woman, who was as much a daughter as an employee. "Let's find out what's going on up there. I knew the old house was getting in pretty bad shape, but I didn't think it was bad enough for somebody to tear it down. Whatever they are doing, it's news." Jessica dashed inside the office and dropped the notepad that was full of 40 years of memories from the town's head librarian, and grabbed a fresh one. Out of habit, she took a quick glimpse in the mirror before heading out the door to check her purple blouse. Her reflection showed a pair of high cheekbones under smooth and silky skin. Her lips were tense and pinched, and her pretty nose featured a slight Betty Davis upturn at the end. She ran her shapely, bright red fingernails through her shoulder-length auburn hair and sighed. It was a fright, but at least the highlights were holding. Her mind was racing, still trying to comprehend what she had seen. Owning the mansion house on the top of the hill had been her dream since childhood, and she had vowed that somehow she would own it. She rushed out of the office past the concerned looks of Emma and her husband Bill, and she jumped into her car. They can't be tearing it down, Jessica thought. They just can't be. She turned her car west down College Street and hit the gas. Nobody would doubt that the mansion house at 1600 College Street had seen better days. The last owner and descendant of the original builder of the house had passed away last year, and in her older years Mrs. Taggart did not have the resources to keep the place up. Jessica's small economy car strained to climb the steep grade of the hill up to the mansion house. Her mind wasn't on the hill, or the struggling engine. All she could do was stare at the house as the skeleton of the roof and dormers reached skyward. Lumber that hadn't seen the light of day in 170 years was exposed to the blue Missouri sky. Two large semi-truck-sized dumpsters sat parked next to the house, and nailed to the north side of the structure was a huge crude debris chute. She pulled in next to a white contractor's truck and parked. She hopped out of her car and saw a familiar face, one that was busy talking on a cell phone. She walked over to Arnie Cox and waited for him to finish what sounded like an order to the lumberyard. Jessica examined the house more closely and realized that it was being renovated, not demolished. The sick feeling that she had in the bottom of her stomach eased, and her curiosity started to intensify. Somebody bought the house from the Taggart estate, but who? Looking at the amount of work going on, the new owner was obviously spending lavish amounts on the house. After what seemed like an eternity, Arnie finally finished his call. "Hey, Jess, what brings you by today?" he asked with a sparkle in his eye. Over the last 10 years, Jessica had become something of an institution in Riverton. Wherever anything was happening, Jessica Thomas was sure to be there with her camera and notebook. She, Arnie and his wife Barbara, had become fairly good friends, sitting in the stands at countless ball games, while Jessica's little brother Philip and Arnie and Barbara's son Steve had starred. "Hey, Arnie. What's going on here?" Jessica, knowing that she would get a straight answer from her friend. "Well, you can see we are tearing off the old roof. We are almost done with that, and then we replace it with a new one. That's about all we are going to be doing until it's time to put on the new siding," he said, concentrating on the job at hand. "Who bought the house? Who is doing all of this?" Jessica pressed. "Hang on a second, okay?" He asked Jessica, and then spoke some instructions into a two-way radio. Jessica heard him telling his workers to check every beam and board for dry rot or any sign of decay. "Sorry about that. I have good guys here, but it's my name on the business, know what I mean?" "Yeah, the guy's name is David." David something or other. "He's from St. Louis. He's around back somewhere looking at the electrical system. You should talk to him in person." "Indeed I should," Jessica thought. "Thanks, Arnie," she said and turned to walk towards the far side of the house. "How's Philip doing at the academy?" she heard Arnie say. Jessica turned and smiled. "So far, so good." "How's Steve doing at the university?" Arnie grinned and said, "He's playing linebacker, and it looks like he may get to start." Jessica smiled as she turned and said, "We will have to do an update about him next week on the sports page." "Thanks again, Arnie." "Lady, this is private property." "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" David Miller shouted at the woman, who was obviously walking towards a very dangerous part of the construction site. The visitor looked absolutely lovely from behind. She was tall and slender, and had a very athletic body. Strong arms flowed from under her short-sleeved blouse, and a pair of very shapely calves descended from under her knee-length skirt. Here was a woman who obviously took very good care of herself. Those thoughts momentarily distracted him. David was, however, not about to let this stranger, who had no apparent business here, walk right into such a hazardous area. The intruder turned on her heels and shot David a disapproving glance, a strained smile, and a look of burning embers in her eyes. David let out a gasp of shock. "My God, it's her." "No," his mind shouted to his heart, "it is not her. She's been gone for 10 years now, this is not, cannot possibly be her." Jessica heard the strong masculine voice bark out at her from behind an outbuilding that she had passed, and turned to confront the rudeness. Standing before her was definitely a handsome man, tall, slender and obviously in great shape. He had a square face with grey eyes, and his shortly cropped blonde hair was blowing gently in the wind. It was one of those faces with a long nose, but not too long, and a strong jawline. She guessed his height at around 6 feet 2 inches, and the sleeveless shirt showed a well-developed upper body and square shoulders. His tight button-fly jeans hung on his hips, as if they were painted on. She would have considered him even more attractive, if he were not looking with what looked like thinly masked horror etched into his strong, masculine face. The look of shock and confusion on his face softened her anger, and she called out across the yard, "I am looking for a Mr. David, something or other. Would that person be you?" At the sound of her voice, Mr. Something or Other look changed from one of puzzlement to one of confidence. "Miller," he said, walking forward, hand extended for a shake. If you are looking for David Miller, you have found him. If you are actually looking for David Something or Other, I can't help you." As Jessica walked towards him, his face broke into an uneasy smile. She offered a hand, and was glad to see that he had a soft, comfortable handshake. She despised men who felt a need to try to impress people by turning a friendly greeting into a crush fest. "My name is Jessica Thomas, and I work for the Sentinel, Riverton's newspaper. This house is a local landmark, and the fact that it is being renovated is important community news. I would like to do an interview with you to discuss what your plans are for the house," she said in her formal professional reporter voice. David Miller turned and looked at the house for staring up and down the outside of the structure. He nervously cleared his throat and said, "For the record, I am renovating this wonderful old house to return it to its former glory." As Jessica waited for him to say more, tension filled the air between them. "That's it?" Jessica asked, somewhat surprised. "Yes, that's it," David said. "People will want to know what you are planning on doing with the house," she said. "Are you going to turn it into a business?" Are you planning on living in the house? She asked. David looked at her and carefully phrased his response. I understand that people want to know, that you want to know, what I am doing here and why I am doing it, but frankly it is a private matter, and I am not going to discuss it. Jessica knew that if she wrote the words down, they would sound much more harsh than the kind and almost apologetic way that he said them. Well, she considered, it was time for a different approach. Well, then, how about if we learn a little about you? Are you a professional renovator? Do you renovate old mansions and sell them for profit? She asked. This time, David's response was a curt no. Well, Jessica thought, this house was obviously a big project and it was going to take some time, and she worked for a newspaper that publishes weekly. There are other ways a reporter can get answers about somebody who is not interested in talking. There was no way she was going to let this attractive stranger remain Mr. Something Garotha. She smiled, thanked him for his time and turned to go. She turned back for a second to ask one more question that had been bothering her since the first moment they had met. One thing. Mr. Miller. Why were you so uneasy when you saw me? You looked like you had seen a ghost. What was wrong? David thought for a moment, and gave Jessica a soft and knowing smile. I don't believe in ghosts. Jessica Thomas. Of course, he knew there was a chance of running into Jessica and Philip, but he didn't expect to do so this soon. She was lovely, strong, assertive, and she had a dazzling smile. David opened his wallet and looked at the wrinkled and worn picture that he carried with him every day. No, there were definite differences in both looks and manners. He put the picture away and stared back at the house. David Miller was a man with a promise to keep, and the appearance of Jessica Thomas was not going to make this difficult task any easier. David knew by the look in Jessica's eyes that she would be back, and that both excited and worried him. This job was hard enough without any added levels of difficulty. It was time to get back to work. 2 hours of research at City Hall and on the internet revealed to Jessica a lot about who David Miller was, but virtually nothing about why he was in Riverton remodeling the mansion on the hill. The trip to City Hall informed her that Riverview House, as it was locally known, sits in a section of the town zoned for residential use. Due to the nature of the zoning law, the owner could use the house as a home office, or even a bed and breakfast, but the laws strictly ruled out such things as high-traffic offices, retail sales or restaurants. Jessica thought that the Riverton City Council, if asked, would have gladly changed the zone on the hill to commercial if David Miller had requested it. There are no neighbors nearby to bother, she pondered, and the council would be happy to see the old building put into use and jobs created in the community. But David Miller hadn't approached the council. Jessica attended every council meeting as part of her job, and she knew that nothing had ever been discussed regarding the house. Would anybody sink that much money into a project before asking that the zoning laws be changed? That made no sense. The building permit that was signed by David Miller showed his address in St. Louis County, Missouri. The permit allowed for renovation of the main house, including some excavation work to shore up the foundation, and for the demolition of 2 small outbuildings. Since no new construction was involved, the permit did not need council approval. On the way back to her office, Jessica pondered what the good-looking man from St. Louis was doing renovating this house in Riverton. 20 minutes of research on the internet gave her more information, but no answers. The new owner of Riverview House was architect David Miller, of Miller & Associates. According to the company web page, David was one of the associates, not the Miller. That person was Randolph Miller, an older man who bore a striking resemblance to the gentleman Jessica had met this morning. Must be his father, she mused. The firm specializes in the construction of new steel office buildings. According to the website, the company built those nameless, faceless 10-story steel and glass structures that were popping up everywhere in cities across America. There was absolutely nothing on the site that had anything to do with renovations or old mansions. David was listed as being in the infrastructure department, whatever that is. The site did feature a picture of each associate and a short bio. David's picture showed a slightly younger, sharply dressed man with a serious face, 31 years old, a graduate of the University of Missouri-Columbia. It was no help at all. Jessica sat back in her chair and thought about this man, David Miller. Young, attractive, obviously successful, He was the kind of man that she had always dreamed of meeting. She couldn't quite place it, but there was something hauntingly familiar about David. She saw a lot of people at work, and she was sure that sometime, somewhere, she had seen this man before. She glanced over to the picture of her on-again, off-again boyfriend Kevin DeWitt. She looked at Kevin's picture, but all she could think about was trying to remember whether she saw a wedding ring on David Miller's hand.